Thank you. Center for Health Policies and Ethics that is currently involved in research ethics educational programs in, among other countries, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Honduras, Mexico, and Peru. Sergio is also a member of our international task force. He is currently involved in the responsible conduct of research for biomedical investigations in the Latin American region. Dr. Litewka is also the project director for the Pan American Bioethics Initiative and the Latin American director of the C.I.P program, a web-based educational initiative for research ethics. I'm going to shut.
It's working. I'm really honored for this invitation, and I am really grateful for the opportunity of being here. So many thanks to all the Commission for bringing me this wonderful opportunity. As Dr. Goodman said, I am, among other things, the director of some initiatives based on the University of Miami, and those are related to Latin America and the Caribbean. So what I'm going to do is focusing mostly in what is my experience in the work that we have been doing there. This information is probably not totally accurate, but because it's very difficult, as it was mentioned before, to have a broad knowledge about all the research activities that are being carried out in elsewhere. But in any case, it's significant. I think it's an approximation about what we find in the Latin American and Caribbean region in terms of the investment made by the NIH and also by the pharmaceutical companies. And what it's important, in my opinion, it's that if you see the countries that are, I don't want to use the word less developed, but with less infrastructure in terms of research, also they have the less investment in terms of research by the pharmaceuticals. However, the NIH is playing a big role there. And when I'm saying that it's playing a big role, it means that most of the research that it's being carried out in the low resources countries in Central America and the Caribbean are generally oriented towards problems that are focused to their own health issues. Other countries like Costa Rica has become, were for a long time a hub for international research. However, I will probably mention that later. Costa Rica is no longer in this moment a trial site because all the trial activities have been suspended by the Costa Rican government. And that has to do probably about the way to trying to address difficulties in terms of governance in the research enterprise. So one of the things, many of the things has been mentioned by my colleagues before, and I will address again some problems that create big gaps in the understanding of how to implement or to harmonize federal standards in the Latin American context. And I think that that could be also applicable, probably also in the United States, what it has to do with informed consent. Most of the complaints about informed consent, it has been mentioned before, it's that the regulations implies, all the regulations oblige that all the informed consent have to have a legalistic approach, a very legalistic approach, that in many cases it's not well understood by the subjects. And on top of this incredible amount of pages that many subjects have to sign, not necessarily that they are informed, but they are signing. There are also the local requirements, which is probably a translation of what the informed consent was attempted to say before. So there is not a very comprehensive disclosures of risk and eventual benefits in terms of all the consequences of the research. And indeed, and again, this could happen in Latin America, but also in many other places here. It's related to the risk of therapeutic misunderstanding, mostly because most of the people who are being enrolled, if they know that they are enrolled in a clinical trial, sometimes they don't understand about which phase of the study are they involved in, whether or not that might have some sort of positive expectation in terms of his or her health condition. IRBs, or research ethics committees, as in the way that they are known in the Latin American context, also are facing several problems. For example, lack of clarity about what is defined about exempt studies. And mostly the overarching problem probably is the lack of resources for IRBs. And when we are talking about lack of resources, we are talking that not only for whether or not their members are receiving any stipend or something like that, but the infrastructure needed to make an IRB work effectively. That means computers, the way to track records, and the way in which the minutes are being taken, periodicity of the meetings, and misunderstandings, and that is related also with lack of educational support in terms of research ethics. For example, clinical ethics committees, this is something I saw many times, clinical ethics committees that eventually work as research ethics committee, and they change their position. As you know, many foreign institutions are starving for cash. I mean, they need money. This is not, again, exclusive related to Latin America, but in many cases, our local IRBs have a conflict of interest because if they reject a study, their institutions will not be funded. And if they do that, they will be outcasted and probably replaced. So this is a big, big problem that we have to keep in mind when we are addressing how to harmonize what we are requesting. Because of the lack of resources, the way in which confidentiality and privacy is assured, it's very, sometimes it's at stake. Many records are more public that you should want to see. And basically, the oversight of clinical trials also is at stake because if you don't have resources to follow up, it's much complicated that you can know what's happening in the future. But not only are the infrastructure problems, in many countries have a total absence of specific regulations for protection of human subjects. So they have some guidelines coming from the Ministry of Health or sometimes from medical associations or scientific associations, but we are talking about guidelines. We are not talking about real rules or regulations. Brazil, have to be mentioned, probably is the most evolved country in terms of having federal laws. But aside from Brazil, most of the Latin American countries are facing a problem in which they have, in some cases, they don't have any regulation at all, which is the case of many Central American and Caribbean countries, and they are working on that. And in other cases, they have what it's known as normative polyphony, lots of regulations overlapping one with the other, and again, maybe that's not exclusive for those countries, but in any case, they have different jurisdictions because they are not federal laws. They are competing with provincial regulations, and even depends on which agency is overseeing the research, if there's that. But in the case that even you have regulations, the other province, who have the oversight of those regulations? And this is another important problem here, because it's not only having regulations, as it was said before, but also how we do enforce those regulations. But other challenges that the Commission will face for sure, it's how the investigator is accountable, and if some research misconduct it's already happens, or at least there are suspicions that might happen. And also, which is the accountability of the foreign institution, not only the researchers, but the institution as a whole. Transparency, it's another problem. Some countries are addressing some activities. For example, if you go to the website of the Peruvian Ministry of Health, they are doing now an effort by their INA, it's the same, their Institute of Health, in making public all the records for the research that they are doing and the funding, where it's coming from. However, again, there is a lot of continuity in that. Brazil is trying to do that since I remember at least 2008, and still we don't have a website in place in which you may have that. But transparency also have to do the lack of have to do with the lack of public trust in the research enterprise. And here I want to mention something which I think it's might be important. Some countries are suffering serious problems of governance. And when I'm saying governance, I'm not talking about governance in terms of the research activity in itself, but the whole concept of the country in itself. So if the regulatory quality is at stake, on the rule of law, it's complicated, and the accountability of the institutions that it's also difficult to be exercised, and the voice of the community is not listened. Maybe we have also to consider, when we are talking about regulations, about aspects that have to do with the whole picture of the problem, and take that in account when we are thinking in harmonizing regulations with different standards. They have to do not only with cultural issues, but with social issues, which is more important. So, because of that, one of the things that has been also, other discussion have to do if there's lack of trust in the research activity, the use of placebos. It's also questioned many times, because the idea of having people vulnerable, that it's being used for goals that are not necessarily related to them, it put another question, which is the definition of vulnerability. And again, I think that we have to address the concept of vulnerability, not only in terms of minorities, but in populations that their voices are not sometimes being listened, or their community has not a real representation in the political situation. I think that's all from my part. Thank you very much for the Commission.
Thank you so much, Sergio.